Good afternoon. My name is Layla Bonneau. I'm a senior project manager at the Council of Chief State School Officers, and I'm proud to lead the Coalition to Advance Future Student Success project. As this project winds down and we reach the obligation deadline for the ESSER funds, we are proud to present a webinar series on sustainability. For today's session, we have partnered with Melissa Young from the Federal Education Group to focus on how to use federal funds to sustain recruiting and retaining a talented educator workforce. Melissa?
Thanks, Layla. So yes, hi everyone. Welcome. My name, as Layla said, is Melissa Young, and I'm an attorney with Federal Education Group. And just for a quick background, we're a law and consulting firm that works with states, school districts, and other educational entities, nonprofits on sort of all of the requirements that apply to federal education funds. And I'm very pleased to give this presentation to support the coalition's work, as obviously sustainability is top of mind for many folks these days. So today, as Layla mentioned, we're here to talk about how traditional U.S. Department of Education grant funds can be used to support educator recruitment and retention. And as Layla mentioned, this is one of 3 presentations. This is a 3-part series. There will also be presentations on how U.S. Department of Education grant funds can be used to support student academic recovery, and also one on how ed funds can be used to support student well-being. So look for those out there as well. So for some table setting, as most of you I'm sure know, school districts, which I'm going to use the term that the federal law uses, which is local educational agencies, or LEAs, but when I use that term, I mean school districts. School districts, or LEAs, receive significant funding for K through 12 education from the U.S. Department of Education, which I will call ED, from ED grant programs. The amount of funding does vary by district, but in many districts, it is an important part of their overall budget. And in addition, the federal rules that apply to federal grant funds often influence the way school districts spend their state and local funds too. So it's sort of important to understand how these rules work so we can have a coordinated approach to spending all of our budget, our state, local, and federal funds. So today we're going to dive into some of the details on how traditional U.S. Department of Education programs can be part of a coordinated approach to educator recruitment and retention strategies. So we're sort of looking at this from some 3 angles. So the most obvious one, which Layla mentioned before, is how these programs might be important for school districts that are looking to sustain effective activities that they're currently supporting with the short-term COVID relief funds. The obligation deadline for those is September 30th of this year, so quite soon. It's also important, though, for LEAs that may be looking to initiate educator recruitment and retention strategies and want to understand how federal funds can be a part of that. And of course, it's also could be important for stakeholders that are engaged with LEAs who want to understand how these funds work for their community and their students. The coalition does have some other resources available on this topic where you can take a deeper dive. So the first resource, and these are hot links, and I believe that the slides will also be made available so you can get these resources. The first resource walks through local spending options, so sort of school district level spending options from the major education federal formula funds for educator recruitment and retention. So this resource, I think, can be important for you because it cites to the federal law, the regulations, and guidance. So many of the things that I'm not going to put citations into this presentation just for ease of getting content. If you're looking sort of for the why and the proof, let's say, that some of the options that we'll be discussing today are actually allowable, that first resource might be a good place to take a look. It has lots of footnotes sort of explaining where this stuff comes from. The second resource speaks more generally about how traditional ed funds can help sustain ESSER activities. ESSER, as we know, is the sort of the largest of the K through 12 COVID relief programs. Again, that's sunsetting soon. And sort of the approach of that resource is more general. It's not specific just to one topic. But what it does is it says, hey, this is a typical way, for example, to spend Title I funds. But here are other options. Here are other allowable things you could do with Title I funds, just to highlight how other activities that maybe your school district is paying for currently with ESSER funds really could be supported, at least in part, with traditional U.S. Department of Education grant funds. So that resource tries to sort of highlight less typical spending options, just so you know that they're available. So some other sort of considerations, because of course we're dealing with federal law and federal law can be really complicated. Some other considerations before we dive in. So first of all, grants that are not addressed in this presentation. I am going to have one sort of long table setting slide on generally talking about all of these rules, but I'm not doing a deep dive into any of them. So, you know, there are limitations to what this presentation can cover today. Whether any particular cost can be charged to a particular program depends on the facts and circumstances of that district, of their spending, of their needs. So again, something that might make sense and might be allowable in one district may not be allowable or make sense in another district. And the fact that a cost is listed in this presentation doesn't mean it's allowable in all circumstances. Also, very importantly, the fact that I don't mention a kind of cost doesn't mean that it's unallowable. Sort of what we're trying to do today is give a flavor of what could be, of what's generally allowable, but it's not an exhaustive list of everything that you could do. The other thing that I wanted to take some time to talk about is that these examples that I'm going to give are sort of illustrative only. They're based on federal law, regulations, and guidance, but we're not trying to take a position on the efficacy of any particular activity or spending decision, or even the examples in here. A lot of the examples that we're using today are based on things that we know school districts are spending their COVID relief funds on now, and maybe looking to transition to other funding sources to support at least parts of them on an ongoing basis. The other thing, as I sort of previously mentioned, is that state and local officials in conversation with their communities are typically best positioned to determine how to spend these funds. Again, something that might make sense in one district really might not in another. Likewise, when we're talking about Title I and Title I spending in schools, something even in the same district might not make sense in one school versus another school. So, you know, a lot of these decisions are very situational in nature. And finally, while I am a lawyer, this is not legal advice. Really, we very much encourage you to engage with local counsel before you make any decisions, and don't make any decisions based on this presentation alone. So sort of the structure of today's presentation and the other presentations that we're going to be recording as well is sort of to give an outline of the very complex administrative structure that surrounds ed grant spending, and talk about how that spending can be fact specific. And then I'm going to dive into a bunch of educator recruitment and retention spending options under these 4 programs: Title I, Title II, Title IV, and IDEA. The first 3 titles here, that's all from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The other thing that I wanted to say is that if you have seen the beginning part of another one of these webinars that we've done, this beginning structure is the same for all of them, because these are sort of the general thresholds that everybody has to know before they spend ed grants. But we also wanted this to be standalone. So if you're only interested in educator recruitment and retention, you don't need to watch all of them to get the background. But if you've seen the beginning part of another one of these, it may be fine for you to move ahead to the specific educator recruitment and retention spending options. So some general things to know about traditional ed grant spending. So before we even get to the rules that apply to these specific programs that I'm going to talk about, sort of what's the landscape out there that we might need to know about. So as I mentioned, there's a very complex structure that applies to U.S. Department of Education grants. In short, sort of at its easiest, this means that ed grants are subject to a lot of rules that come from a lot of places. So there's many sources that we need to know about in general when we're spending our ed grant funds. This slide I'm going to flag is going to take a while. I promise none of the rest of the slides will take as long. This slide will take a while though, because we're really sort of trying to give you the architecture of the different rules, where they come from, so you're not intimidated by them. So you can feel more confident in sort of diving into deciding whether or not a particular use of funds may be allowable or not. So starting at the top, sort of the most important are what we list here as program statutes. Those are also just known as laws. They are passed by Congress, and they include laws that I'm sure you have heard of, like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESSER, that's where Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV come from. IDEA is another law, and Perkins, which is for career and technical education, is another law. So that's sort of the top level, the laws that are passed by Congress. The next set of things to know about are what I'm going to call here are program regulations. So program regulations are put out by the U.S. Department of Education through a formal rulemaking process. There's a whole set of things that they have to go through to issue or promulgate is the term, regulations. And sort of a way to think about regulations is, one, there has to be a law in order to have regulations. But two, they're sort of looking to fill in specifics that may have not been addressed in the law itself. So importantly, for even the programs we're talking about today, not all programs have program regulations. For example, Title I does, IDEA does, but other programs do not. Other common programs do not. And regulations are important because they do indeed also have the force of law. They are legal requirements that you must follow. So there's some other fun stuff in the education grant sphere, and those are what we're terming here ed-specific, U.S. Department of Education specific administrative rules. And they come in two forms. There's laws and regulations. And one of the laws that I said here is the General Education Provisions Act, GEPA. That actually has something that some of you may have heard of called FERPA, which is where those privacy rules come from. That's actually in GEPA. GEPA does some other stuff about due process and hearing rights and things like that. But those are sort of administrative type laws. And then there's regulations that are sort of, again, filling those rules out a little bit more in this sort of short term. What we call that often is EDGAR, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. So there's a set of administrative rules. There's also, and very importantly, a set of rules not from ED, from the Office of Management and Budget. And those regulations are known as the Uniform Grant Guidance. So interestingly, those rules, the UG as it's called, apply to almost all federal grants, including all of the Department of Education grants that we'll be talking about today. And they include a lot of different rules. They include rules on things like procurement, inventory management, internal controls, cash management, employee time records if someone's paid with federal funds. And they detail certain costs that are never allowable. They have certain audit requirements, among a whole lot of other rules. So the UG might be one of the most important sources of federal rules that potentially you've never heard of. If you're a federal program person, you've definitely heard of the UG. If you're in your district and you're the chief academic officer, you may have never, of course, understandably heard of the UG, but just so you know, that's where another set of rules is coming from. The other thing that can be very important is ed guidance. And so that's written guidance, typically written in more plain language. It's supposed to be easier to understand. It doesn't have the force of law, which is important to know, but it does have a huge influence on state and local spending because it articulates sort of ed's expectations for how that program should be run. So ed guidance is very important, not only for understanding ED's expectations, which is important from a compliance standpoint, but it's also important because if you don't, which makes sense, if you don't want to read all of the other things that I just mentioned, the law, the regulations, whatever, let's say you're the chief talent officer in your school district, a good, I think, useful place often is to go to that ed guidance because it's in much clearer language. So if there's something that you're interested in specifically, you can look it up in a Q&A in ed's guidance and it's much more accessible. And finally, the last thing to know about are state and local laws and rules. So the federal government has a requirement when you're spending ed grant money that it also has to be consistent with state and local laws and rules too. So for example, at the local level, if you're buying something with federal funds, not only do you have to comply with federal procurement rules, you also have to comply with any state and local procurement rules that may apply to you as well. So state and local rules actually factor in very important ways to federal funds as well. If you're never allowed to spend money in your school district on a given cost, you're not going to be permitted to spend federal money on that cost either. So that's sort of an interplay between these federal grant rules and your state and local grant rules as well. So what does this all mean in practice? It means it's really complicated and it can make it hard to discern what's allowable. So hopefully this presentation will help illuminate some of the options that you may not have heard of before. So in this sort of complex soup of all of these rules, there are many factors that affect spending decisions. So some of them are pretty obvious and just practical things that we wanted to highlight before we sort of dive into the specific programs. So right now in practice, you know, unless a district gets an increase in U.S. Department of Education grant funds, those ed grant funds are paying for something right now. They're recurring grants and they're paying for something. So that means if you want to spend money on something else, you're going to have to move money away from something you're spending on right now. So those can be really hard and complicated decisions. The other thing is that all of the programs I'm talking about today are called state administered programs. So all that means is that the U.S. Department of Education gives that money. They have the money, they then give it to the state, and then the state is responsible for distributing the bulk of those funds to school districts. Because of that sort of process, because these are state administered program funds, it means that states are responsible for taking the steps they deem important and necessary to ensure compliance with the federal rules. And this means that states have an enormous influence over local spending of these ed grant funds. So you may see allowability, for example, that's different in one state to the next. So understanding, if you're at the school district level, understanding your state's rules around these federal grant funds is really important as well, and affects obviously what you can do with those funds at the local level. And finally, another practical thing that we really wanted to sort of highlight are that compliance concerns like monitoring findings or audit findings are major spending drivers. So in short, what we see often is that if a district hasn't gotten in trouble for spending the way it currently does, it's sort of incentivized not to change its spending patterns. So unless that district really feels secure that what it's going to do is going to be okay from its state and okay under all of those laws, it may not choose to change its spending patterns, even though it might want to, because it has understandably compliance concerns, because you can see we have this huge compliance structure built up around these grants. So again, if you're seeking to maybe change the way a school district is spending its money, but really tackling those compliance concerns head on can really, we've seen it really change the way people think about these funds so they can feel more comfortable about changing their spending to potentially something that's more effective than what they're spending on now. Another sort of very important point, and then I promise we're about to dive into examples, But another really important point here is that spending is fact specific, which I keep saying, but I want to drive that home because of what that looks like in the context of some of these rules that I talked about. So the first thing is whether a cost is necessary and reasonable under the circumstances really matters for whether or not you can use ed funds to pay for it. That necessary and reasonable, I'm putting quotes around it, is actually a standard that comes from the Uniform Grant Guidance, which are those OMB rules I talked about a few slides ago. So necessary and reasonable is just a good practice, and it really does sound exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of a prudent person standard. Does that make sense in light of the circumstances? And that's going to be a fact-specific inquiry. Another important thing with traditional U.S. Department of Education grant funds is making sure that who benefits from the cost and whether those beneficiaries are eligible. So U.S. Department of Education programs are typically designed to serve specific groups or specific kinds of activities. So making sure that you're aligning that specific activity to that funding source is important. There are fiscal tests that LEAs have to comply with, like supplement, not supplant. Those of you who are familiar with federal grants, I'm sure have heard of supplement, not supplant. The important thing to highlight, we're going to dive into supplement, not supplant for each of the programs that we're talking about today. But supplement, not supplant, the test itself for compliance is different for different programs. It is not the same for every program. That does two things. It can make it a little bit harder to navigate for sure. But the other thing means that in some programs, you actually may have far more spending options than you think you do because supplement, not supplant applies differently. So that's something to look at as well. And then finally, and sometimes I think an overlooked piece is whether or not a district's grants management system, which can be a whole bunch of things, but whether or not it has systems that are capable of accounting for and documenting the cost consistent with all these federal requirements. And sort of what do I mean by that? Well, some costs have sort of more complicated documentation rules than others. If you're paying employees with federal funds, there are certain documentation rules. For example, they're not horribly difficult to comply with, but they're out there. And just making sure that your district is in a position to comply with those rules, depending on where you fall, that may mean that some kind of cost is more attractive than another kind of cost based on those systems. And as I promised, with all of that table setting, we will finally dive into the programs. And so we're going to start with Title I, Part A. So Title I, Part A, which I'm going to refer to as Title I, Title I is ED's largest K through 12 grant program. P.S. It can also pay for pre-K in some circumstances, but Title I provides supplemental funding to help districts and schools that are affected by poverty expand opportunities for educationally disadvantaged students. And I'm laying it out that way because there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes in how people think about Title I, and I'll get to that. But it's a program sort of driven, the funding is driven by poverty, but the students that are served are not low-income students. The students that are served, although they're in low-income schools, the students that are served are academically struggling students. And I'll talk about what that means in the context of two program models. So at its sort of core, Title I funds are typically, most of them are typically spent at the school level. In a few slides, I'll talk about there's some options to spend funds sort of off the top and do district level Title I spending activities for your Title I schools, but at its core, Title I is a school-based program. And there's two models that are allowed, that a Title I school is allowed to operate. So Title I schools that have at least 40% poverty, or you can also seek a waiver from your state if your poverty threshold is lower, may operate something called a school-wide program. And in a school-wide program, the school may use Title I funds to upgrade its entire educational program, and all students are eligible to participate in Title I funded activities. That's contrasted with a targeted assistance program, which any school can operate, above 40%, below 40%. Any school can operate a targeted assistance model, but that's different in that it's not comprehensive. Instead, the school must use Title I funds to provide additional supports to identified Title I students that are struggling to meet state standards. So again, I want to go back and unpeel that and highlight what that means. So while this money is directed to schools based on their poverty levels, once the money gets to the school, the program is intended to help academically struggling students. But this looks different depending on whether or not you're a school-wide school or a targeted assistance school. So again, a school-wide model is designed to permit, and basically the policy choice when Congress moved to school-wide models, the policy choice was at some point when you get above a certain poverty threshold, it's likely that many schools are struggling, and it's not fair to just pull out student A and student B. All students could benefit from a sort of comprehensive school improvement. So that's what the school-wide program model is seeking to do. Any or all students can be served in the school, but the goal is to raise student academic achievement and with the needs of the most struggling students being very important. So a good example might be perhaps Title I could pay for teacher planning time and adding, actually we've worked with districts that have done this. If for example, a Title I school, let's say in your district, they didn't have music or art or physical education, something like that, adding that, let's say a special to the school day so the students can participate in that, with the goal being that now you can have teacher planning time during that special time where perhaps teachers can look over data to better target their instruction to struggling students. That's an example of an educator focused, and with a student benefit too, if they're getting music or art or something that they haven't done before, where all students might benefit from that. Let's say you do that with all of your first grade. All of your first graders may benefit from that, but most particularly will be the struggling students, because hopefully the teachers would be using the data to better target their instruction to those students once they know who they are. So that's the theory of action of a school-wide model. And in a targeted assistance model, only specific students are served, and they are selected, again, based on their academic risk, not their low income status. Of course, there may be crossover there sometimes. I'm not saying that, but to find students that you're serving in a targeted assistance school, you're looking at students that are struggling to meet state standards. So here are some common misperceptions, and Title I comes with a lot of myths. Actually, the Department of Education, I believe in 2016, put out a great guidance document trying to dispel some of these myths in school-wide programs. So Title I comes with a lot of myths and misperceptions, and hopefully we'll put some of them to rest today with this presentation. But it's a very common misperception that Title I activities must be limited to only reading and mathematics, and that's not correct. Title I can pay for a wide range of academic subjects as part of what the law calls a well-rounded education. The law itself defines what's included in a well-rounded education, but it includes everything from science to engineering to music, art, PE, foreign language, you name it. If it's part of a well-rounded education, Title I can help support it. So Title I is not limited to only reading and math. Also, and importantly, Title I can support non-academic activities that could contribute to academic achievement. So this could include things like mentoring, behavioral supports, mental health, and other student well-being and engagement supports, attendance supports, those kinds of things. We are going to have a separate presentation on student well-being, but of course, when we're talking about educator supports, when we're talking about student academic achievement, these are all holistic things, and Title I can play a role in all of that. I mentioned before this rule that many federal education programs have called supplement, not supplant, and Title I also has a fiscal rule called supplement, not supplant, and the policy purpose of it is to help ensure that Title I provides extra support beyond what an LEA would normally spend on education with state and local funds. So let me say that again. The point of supplement, not supplant, is to make sure that Title I sort of is giving extra supports for kids beyond what they would receive just under normal state and local funding. Supplement, not supplant, particularly in Title I, has a huge influence on how districts spend their Title I funds, and in fact can have a huge influence on how districts spend their state and local funds as well. The important thing, I mean, we do whole presentations on supplement, not supplant in Title I, so I'm just going to cut to the chase here and on the next slide. But the important thing to know is that Title I supplement, not supplant rule changed from the earlier version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was known as No Child Left Behind, or NCLB. When we got to the current version, which is known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSER, that has a changed supplement, not supplant requirement from what it had been previously. But those changes are not particularly well understood at the district level. The bottom line about why should you care if you've never heard of supplement, not supplant, why should you care that the rules changed? Well, these changes fundamentally make it easier for Title I funds to work with state and local funds and other funds to support struggling students, which is important for sustainability. So Title I before sort of didn't play well with others. It was hard to coordinate Title I with state and local funds. These changes to the Title I supplement, not supplant rules have really made it easier to coordinate those funds if they're better understood. And I'll give a quick example of what that looks like in the next slide. So the sort of baseline compliance rule now for Title I under ESSER, the current version of Title I, is that LEAs have to demonstrate that the method that they use to allocate their state and local funds provides each school with all of the state and local money they would have gotten if they didn't participate in a Title I program. I know that's a lot of words, but basically what you're looking for is for the methodology to be Title I neutral. What does that mean? Let me give an example. So let's say, and this is a very common way that we fund schools, let's say that under the funding methodology that the district is using to distribute their state and local funds, they provide every elementary school a state and locally funded instructional coach. It would violate Title I supplement, not supplant requirement if the LEA expected Title I schools to pay for that instructional coach with Title I funds. Why? Because that's something they allocate to all of their schools. So it shouldn't be like, oh, hey, you have Title I funds, you pick it up. Why? Because then it's not extra. But what Title I could do, and it wouldn't violate supplement, not supplant now under these new rules, Title I could pay for an additional instructional coach with Title I funds without violating the rule. This is a really detailed requirement. I understand it. I hope that that example at least makes it make a little bit more sense in a practical way. And here is a link to the U.S. Department of Education's guidance on this topic. So before I dive into some of the more specific examples that I'm going to have on the following slides, I just sort of wanted to explain that there's essentially three ways that these examples could be funded. One is at the district level. So again, I've said previously, Title I is very much a school-based program, and most Title I funds are spent at the school level. However, LEAs have the option to reserve some Title I funds for district-managed activities for all or a subset of their Title I schools. I'll give you an example of that. I think we have some of these examples, but just so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about the examples in a second. Let's say you're having a principal retention issue with your new principals. You could, at the district level, reserve Title I funds for your Title I schools that are having principal retention issues, let's say, and maybe have a principal academy where principals in those schools could work together, some mentoring, and all of that. but that would be sort of district funded for, in this example, a subset of their Title I schools. So that's one way you can spend your Title I funds. Another way is, as we mentioned before, at the school level, through a school-wide program where any or all of the students can participate in that program, or through a targeted assistance program where only identified Title I students may participate in the Title I program. So here are some examples that are relevant to educator recruitment and retention and other kinds of support. You know, I want to just spend a second to say Title I is often not thought of as a way to support educators. Title II, which is the next program I'm going to talk about, Title II is often thought of as that federal program, but Title I can play a really important role to support educators, including school leaders. So what do I mean? Well, financial incentives and rewards to attract and retain qualified and effective teachers, and Title I school principals. And you can see there, up to 5% of the Title I's total Title I allocation can be used to support teachers in school for incentives and rewards for teachers in schools identified for improvement. Professional development for teachers. Title I is very rarely thought about for professional development, but professional development for teachers, other Title I educators or para-educators and Title I principals. Coaching and mentoring for Title I teachers, educators, and principals. Induction programs for new Title I teachers, principal academies, the example I mentioned before, for Title I school principals. And again, think about it, this could either be done at the school level, or you could do a district run, let's say, induction program for all of your new Title I teachers in your Title I elementary schools or something like that. School climate initiatives to support recruitment and retention in Title I schools. So this could include, you know, other supports that can help classroom teachers, like having more school counselors, positive behavioral interventions and support initiatives, attendance supports. Those can all help make educators' lives easier and support recruitment and retention initiatives. So Title II is sort of the classic, I would say, educator funding source that we think of. It's designed to provide supplemental funding to support effective instruction. So again, this is classically thought of as the funding source for educators. It is, but all of these other funding sources can also play an important role. Sort of some baseline rules, some table setting rules for Title II to know about are that activities supported with Title II funds must be consistent with Title II's purposes and address the needs of all students, including students with disabilities, English learners, and gifted and talented students. Districts have to prioritize Title II funds for high poverty, low performing schools, but the funds don't actually have to go to specific schools like they do for Title I. For example, an LEA could use funds at the district level, use Title II funds at the district level to provide instructional coaching in early literacy schools to these high poverty, low performing schools, but they would manage that at the district level. So Title II, it can be allocated to the school level, but it's not required the way Title I works. So you have a little bit more flexibility there in how you want to design initiative, which if you're doing something like professional development may make sense if you're wanting to do a coordinated professional development program. On the other hand, maybe a certain school needs a specific kind of PD, and that's okay as well. You could use Title I funds for that as well, as long as you're prioritizing high poverty, low performing schools. And Title II has a number of stakeholder consultation requirements that you must do when you're planning, updating, and also to improve your Title II spending. Title II also has a supplement, not supplant requirement, but it works differently than it does in Title I. So in Title II, supplanting is generally presumed when an LEA uses Title II funds to pay for an activity that's required by state, local, or another federal law, or if an LEA used Title II funds to pay for an activity that it supported last year with state or local funds. So if those two presumptions happen, supplanting will be presumed, but these presumptions can be overcome in certain circumstances. So let's say, I'll use an instructional coach example. Let's say you were paying for an instructional coach in a struggling school last year with local funds, but your tax revenue has gone down, and you could no longer afford to keep that position with your local funds. Title II, the presumption of supplanting could possibly be rebutted in that circumstance if you kept certain documentation. So, these are things to think about how supplanting may be triggered, but it can be overcome in certain circumstances. So here are some ways that Title II can support educator recruitment and retention activities. I'm flagging here that the most common use from research, we can see the most common use of Title II funds is for professional development. So professional development is certainly on the table here as well. But what we wanted to do was highlight some other kinds of activities that are more related directly to educator recruitment and retention activities. In our practice, what we've seen is that a lot of school districts don't know that these are allowable spending options, even though actually many of them are written into the law itself and are articulated in ED's guidance. And again, you can go back to that first document, which has all the citations, if you'd like more backup on some of these spending options being allowable. So help in screening candidates and enabling early hiring. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with, there's a whole bunch of research on early hiring to the extent you can do it being very important for retention and obviously for getting teachers, sort of the teachers that you need by the first day of school. Differential and incentive pay for principals and other school leaders and for teachers in high need academic subjects and other specialty areas, like maybe depending on where you are, math, science, special education are common ones where there are needs. Advancement and professional growth opportunities, induction and mentoring programs for new educators, including early release time, compensation for mentors, and evidence-based professional development for novice educators and their mentors. So these are all allowable uses of Title II funds, assuming everything else is okay. Supplement, not supplant, and the other rules we talked about before. Career advancement opportunities for current staff members, such as paraprofessionals, to gain the credentials to become classroom instructors. That's a very little known option. It's actually discussed in ED guidance, and that can be an important option for a district to think about. Recruiting qualified individuals from other fields to become teachers, principals, or school leaders. Building educator pipelines. Training on how to differentiate performance, provide useful feedback, and use those evaluation results to inform decision-making about professional development, improvement strategies, and personnel decisions, and a system for auditing the quality of evaluation and support systems. Feedback mechanisms to improve school working conditions, including periodically and publicly reporting feedback on educator support and working conditions. Educator residency programs that meet certain requirements. And we know these are becoming increasingly popular. Again, ED's guidance discusses educator residency programs. Teacher leader hybrid roles, sort of trying to keep teachers in the classroom while giving them leadership roles. And time for collaboration among teachers, principals, or other school leaders to support curriculum writing, planning, instructional design, all of those things that you can get if there's some collaboration time. So those are sort of the big buckets of educator recruitment and retention related activities that are permissible to be funded with Title II Part A that maybe you haven't heard about before. So Title IV Part A. Title IV is designed, Title IV does a lot of things, but Title IV is intended to provide supplemental funding to sort of do three buckets. To help support a well-rounded education, it's the first, to improve school conditions for student learning, sort of we sometimes talk about that as safe and healthy students, that's the second bucket, and the third bucket is to improve the use of technology. The spending choices, and I'm not going to get into all the machinations about Title IV. Title IV has a lot of rules that apply to it, but those spending choices that a district makes may be affected by requirements if the district receives $30,000 or more in Title IV funds. At the point at which you get $30,000 or more in funds, other rules kick in. There's a required needs assessment. There's mandatory spending minimums. So all of that may affect an LEA's spending choices. Also, LEAs have to develop objectives for their Title IV programs and intended outcomes for their Title IV funded activities. So when spending Title IV funds, LEAs have to prioritize schools that have the greatest needs as determined by the LEA. So there's some flexibility there. Have the highest percentages or numbers of children from low-income families, are identified for improvement under the Title I accountability requirements, or are identified as a persistently dangerous school. So schools should be prioritized to be funded. And again, just like I said with Title II, the funding doesn't have to go directly to those schools. It could be managed at the district level on behalf of those schools. And LEAs, like with Title II, have to meaningfully consult with a wide array of stakeholders when designing their Title IV programs. So Title IV, Part A, also has a supplement, not supplant requirement. It is the same, actually, as Title II's. In Title IV, supplanting is generally presumed when an LEA uses Title IV funds to pay for an activity that's required by state, local, or other federal law, or an LEA uses Title IV funds to pay for an activity it's supported with state or local funds the year before. And again, like I discussed in the Title II recording, these presumptions can be overcome in certain circumstances, for example, if there are budget cuts. Okay, so let's get into examples. So again, something that is thought about for Title II, but sometimes not for Title I and not for Title IV, is professional development for teachers in those three, and for teachers and administrators in those three buckets. Well-rounded education, improving school conditions for student learning, and improving the use of technology. The salaries of personnel to carry out Title IV activities, including, for example, athletic administrators and other roles that are consistent with those three buckets. Activities to improve the delivery of a well-rounded education, address school conditions, and to support the use of technology to support recruitment and retention. So there are some districts that are looking at innovative ways to integrate things and keep teachers engaged, either to begin with your school district or to stay with your school district. And Title IV might be a source of money to keep those sort of more innovative programs and use them to support staff in those programs. And finally, we're getting to IDEA Part B. So IDEA is to support students with disabilities, but IDEA can be used often for many more spending choices than is commonly understood. So how is IDEA Part B structured? Well, it has two grant programs, and I'm sort of going to talk about both of them. There's Section 611 of IDEA, which is Part B, which supports students with disabilities from ages 3 to 21. And then there's Section 619, which supports students from ages 3 to 5. IDEA also has, I'm going to just say IDEA, not IDEA Part B, but that's what I mean. IDEA also has a supplement, not supplant requirement, but LEAs actually meet their supplement, not supplant responsibility when they meet their local maintenance of effort requirement. So in other words, there's no extra thing to do for supplement, not supplant at the local level for IDEA Part B. If you meet local maintenance of effort, sometimes known as MOE, if you meet local MOE, you're going to meet supplement, not supplant as well. So here are some key things, some sort of fundamentals to know about IDEA Part B. And again, for those of you involved in special education, you know this, but for those of you who are not, maybe I'll show some examples that maybe you didn't know could be funded from IDEA Part B. So at its core, LEAs are expected to use IDEA Part B for special education and related services. Special education means adapting instruction to meet the unique needs of students with disabilities. I want to flag that this is often construed more narrowly than it has to be, and that LEAs may have more service options than realized. So remember, another requirement of IDEA is to have students be in the least restrictive environment. So even if a student with disability needs extra supports or adaptation, often that can be, or sometimes it depends on the student and their IEP, their individualized education plan, that adapted instruction could be in the general classroom, or it could be with other students that are struggling who may not be identified as students with disabilities. So again, it's about adapting instruction, but it doesn't mean segregating these students. Special education also means related services, and those are things like transportation or other support services that can help students with disabilities benefit from special education. So when we talk about special education and related services, that's what we're talking about. LEAs, and I'm going to talk about this at the end, also, and this is, a lot of people have never heard of this, also have the option to reserve funds for coordinated early intervening services, sometimes known as CEIS, to support struggling general education students. So some of this money, up to 15%, I'll talk about that. You have the option to reserve it to support struggling general education students. That's an option that a lot of people don't know about. I also want to flag that some districts are actually required to do this. And I won't get into why, but some districts are required to do early intervening services for struggling general education students. But that is an option your district has to use its IDEA Part B funds. So here are some examples of IDEA Part B educator support, which relates obviously to recruitment and retention spending options. So one is professional development for all educators who work with students with disabilities. This includes school leaders. And I just want to flag, this is not limited to special education teachers. It can include classroom teachers as long as the professional development is geared to the needs of students with disabilities. So this can include topics like, and we just listed some of them here, the use of technology for students with disability, universal design for learning approaches, progress monitoring, effective instructional and behavioral practices, effective literacy interventions, effective math interventions, and secondary transitions, and the effective use of data. So there's obviously other kinds of professional development that might be important to support students with disabilities. But the thing we wanted to flag here is it's not just professional development for special education teachers. You can also include your general education teachers and others, as long as the PD is focused on supporting students with disabilities. I mean, remember, all general education teachers at some point have students with disabilities in their classrooms. So making sure that those general education teachers know how to best support students with disabilities is really important, and IDEA can play a very important role in that. It also can do these other types of educator support, recruitment, and retention activities. So high quality certification programs for teachers of students with disabilities, site-based job embedded professional development that could lead to certification in certain content areas like reading or math. Site-based job embedded professional development for general educators that leads to certification in special education. And since we know many districts are struggling with recruiting and retaining special education teachers, this is a potential option to think of. Hiring effective duly certified special education teachers in the highest need LEAs. Induction, coaching, and mentoring programs. Again, this could include release time for coaches and mentors and training for coaches and mentors. And this could also include PD and other teacher and staff costs used to support non-disabled students in kindergarten through 12. This is, we're going to the CEIS, who need additional academic and behavioral supports to succeed in the general education environment. And again, this is an option, unless you're mandated to do it. This is an option. You can spend up to 15% of your funds on this for struggling students in the general education environment, and to support professional development of your general staff to support those students. So again, just wanted to flag, because that's not an option that sometimes that's not an option that districts know about. So with that, I know we did a lot in an hour. just my disclaimer slide that, again, this is general information and not intended to be legal advice, but thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you so much to the coalition for the opportunity to give this presentation today. Thanks so much. I hope you have a great day.